Space. The Earth was visible below, several more planets were flying above it. The stars in space were shining brightly. A big city with tall buildings, white birds flew and feathers fell from them. A deity created this world. However, there are very few people left who believe in God. At that time humanity trusted only information. A crowd of people walked through the city, lanterns illuminated the road. Tall buildings could be seen in the distance, some of the windows in which were on fire. A social network in which there was a post called Eyewitness Testimony of the Chimera. From the user there was a photograph of a monster that was hidden by a shadow, but the wings and horns of the monster were visible. Below there was a post, people with divine abilities, the creation of a special army of soldiers with supernatural skills. The Chimera with bright red eyes, large wings and long horns waved its paw. Behind it there was a page with a video. Next to it, it was written, protecting citizens from the Chimera with the help of specially trained troops. A guy with brown hair who smiled, holding out his hand over which a fire was burning. A guy in a gray suit and with red hair who raised his hand, around which blue energy was glowing. A guy who clasped his fist with his palm. Fragments of stones were flying next to him. A girl with pink hair and green energy glowing around her. A huge bright orange explosion in the city. A great war began. A big explosion that left a huge cloud of fire in the sky. This war became the most destructive in the entire history of mankind. The phone, which had a red image of the city, its screen was completely broken. Those who survived scoffed, saying that all this happened because of human arrogance. Only a few knew about the realities of the war. Destroyed stones in the city on which many people lay. A man with blonde hair in a black suit who held a lightning bolt in his hands. A man with black hair and beard in a red kimono with a black belt who held a spear in his hands. A bare-chested man with a white beard and hair who also held spear in hand, holding out his hand. The reason for all this was none other than God. Monsters. Some were holding weapons in their hands. Some had helmets on their heads. One eye on their head was glowing with a red light, and they surrounded a group of 4 people. A guy with brown hair, around whom blue energy was glowing. A girl with purple hair, who was holding in the hands of 2 pistols. A guy with black hair, who had wings behind his back, and a guy with blue hair with flames burning around his hand. There were those who tried to resist God. A guy with dark hair reached out, cutting off the head of one of the monsters with blue energy, who opened his eyes and mouth wide, screaming. There was Yaksha's team. The girl kicked the monster's face, a blue light emanating from her kick. The girl with purple hair extended her hand, holding a gun in her hand, next to which there was a yellow light from the shots. The god protesters, the devil dragon, and countless enemies tried to stop them. A dark dragon that only had a red mouth with many teeth and large red horns visible, its eyes also glowing red. It spread its wings. Red sky. Many silhouettes of monsters standing behind each other. The huge dragon opened its mouth. Saliva flowed between its teeth. Its red eyes glowed brightly. Former Russian Federation. Sakura Republic. Dark sky. A small house next to a lake, which was surrounded by trees and bushes. The purple-haired girl put her hands on her waist and frowned with displeasure. She tilted her head, asking if he was sleeping. The guy raised his head, his face hidden in shadow. He stood with his back looking at the blue projection of the earth, around which the stars were flying, and replied that it seemed that a gate would soon open not far from the Sea of Okhotsk. The girl crossed her arms over her chest, raised an eyebrow at the guy and said that it was the first time she had seen a gate of such a scale. He replied that he thought it was worth calling for help. The girl looked at the guy putting on his jacket and saying that he needed to check. The guy straightened the sleeves on his jacket and looking at him, the girl with purple hair asked about the gate and whether it was really alone. The guy nodded silently, pursing his lips. He opened his mouth. His eyes were not visible because of his hair, and he said that he was not interested in small catches. He was going to the authorities. The girl silently raised her head at him, blushing slightly. The guy put his hand on her shoulder. The girl knitted her eyebrows, calling a guy named Gon. He kept his hand on the shoulder of the girl, who lowered her head and asked Honanha to take care of the younger one. The girl looked up at the guy, looking at him with a sad expression on her face. She hugged him from behind and closed her eyes, blushing and shouting that she would go with him. They were one team. Gon replied that he was also part of the team, and the girl's eyes widened in surprise and her mouth parted. The guy with brown hair was sitting on one knee, next to the slope of the mountain. Next to him were a guy with black hair, a girl with purple hair who was holding pistols, and another person with blue hair. Gon said that they need him to destroy God. The guy with brown hair lowered his head, looking at the many tanks that passed below. He pushed off the edge of the cliff with his boots, small stones falling to the side. The brown-haired boy frowned as he flew down, blue and green energy surrounding him as he fell. The guy landed on the ground with his hand on the ground, a lot of rocks falling to the side as he landed. A guy with dark hair, a girl with purple hair, and a guy with blue hair jumped forward behind the main character. They flew above him. The girl extended her pistols forward. The guy with brown hair waved his hand. There was a cloud of dust around him. A rocket flew from a ship that was floating on the water, leaving behind a cloud of dust. A white rocket with a yellow sticker on it flew across the sky. The guy with dark hair looked at her, frowning and opening his mouth. A blue light glowed around his hand as he stood above the rocket as it flew down. The guy clenched his hand into a fist, pushing off the ground with his foot. The blue energy around him became more and he said that they were shooting nuclear bombs. The guy was flying across the sky, heading towards a bomb that was flying down on him. You could see him pushing off the air a couple of times. The main character held out his palms, opening them, bright white and blue energy emanating from them, glowing around them. He waved his arms, flying right in front of the bomb that was flying towards him. There was a strong explosion of blue energy, fragments scattered in different directions. The main character stood in a cloud of dust, surrounded by blue energy. He frowned, a faint blue light glowing from his hand, his hair blowing in the wind. He looked to the side, eyebrows furrowed, noticing something. The main character jumped away from his seat, pushing off the air, a cloud of dust flying behind him. Blue water with waves passing through it. 2 ships were floating in the water, and the main character stood above them, head down and gathering blue energy around his hand. He flew down sharply, crashing into the ship, and there was a bright fiery explosion. The guy landed on the ground, resting his fist on the ground. Dark smoke from the ship was visible behind him. The main character frowned and raised his head, looking forward. He walked forward along the beach, his hand clenched into a fist, while a bright, strong explosion went off on the ship behind him. Many monsters, a winged manticore that growled loudly, a cyclops holding a club that opened its mouth wide, a green frog with yellow eyes and a huge snake with sharp fangs that opened its mouth wide. The monsters looked at the main character, standing over him and growling loudly. The guy put his hand to his head. A bright blue light emanated from him. The brown-haired boy scratched his ear, tilting his head slightly. He frowned and looked up, putting his hand to his chest and asking if they had said anything bad about him. Tall houses with white windows, the capital of the Republic of Korea, Seoul. A monster in iron armor, with long horns and sharp claws, waved its hand to strike, screaming loudly and smiling widely. The main character punched the monster, raising a cloud of dust next to him, and clenched his second fist behind him. The guy waved his hand, putting it to his chest. Blue lightning flew around him and he frowned. Blue energy appeared around the guy's clenched fist. He swung his hand sharply, releasing 2 beams of blue energy that cut the yellow monster into 2. The other 3 monsters opened their mouths wide, revealing sharp fangs, and roared loudly. The guy stood as several monsters ran towards him, blue energy emanating from him, exploding around the guy. The main character smiled and clenched his hands into fists, while 2 monsters jumped at him. The guy said that they were cute creatures. He crossed his arms in front of his face as blue lightning flew around. The boy's eyes also began to glow with a bright blue light. He spread his arms to the sides, and a powerful explosion of energy erupted from the guy, burning the monsters around him. He lowered his hands, standing on the ground. Everything around was scorched. White fog was flying across the ground. Someone called for help and the main character turned towards the sound. He looked down from the roof where people were screaming and asked for more chimeras. The guy put his foot on the edge of the roof and smiled, clenching his hands into fists, and saying that the world has become so cruel. The main character was holding a black chip between 2 fingers, which had bright blue contacts. The guy said, "Let's see." He raised his hand and closed one eye with a smile, looking at the chip and asking if this was the same chimera chip. Someone loudly called to the guy who stood against the backdrop of the city, raising his hand high, in which he held the chip. They called him loudly again and the main character frowned and turned to the side. A girl in a military uniform and with short red hair put her hand to her waist, holding a weapon in her other hand, asking what squad he was in. A guy in a military uniform with black hair was sitting next to him on a stone. There was a weapon next to him and he said that the youth are now not afraid of anything at all. The main character looked over his shoulder at them, asking what hunters were. The military man with black hair closed his eyes and sighed, asking whether he doesn't even know this and whether he still hasn't registered as a hunter. They stood on the roof opposite the guy and the girl shouted that this was the Jeongmek zone. The military guy said that collecting chimera chips was prohibited here. The main character raised his eyebrows in surprise, opened his eyes wide and asked about Jeongmek. asking whether it was also necessary to obtain permission to hunt chimeras. The girl turned towards the military guy, asking him who he was, and he didn't seem to know at all. The guy with black hair sighed and lowered his head, asking if this was important now, and they were ordered to evacuate all the hunters. The military guy began to approach the main character, saying that it was too dangerous here and he needed to go to a safe zone. The girl raised the walkie-talkie, looking at her, and called the headquarters, saying that this was the 23rd Reconnaissance Group and an unregistered hunter had been discovered. The main character smiled, closing his eyes and putting his palms to each other. Jongmek said. A shadow appeared behind him and a guy with black hair looked at it in surprise. The main character asked for forgiveness, taking the walkie-talkie from the hands of the military man. He picked her up with a big smile, saying that he came out after 3 years, so he didn't know. He was talking to the Jongmek company now. A military man with black hair pointed at him with a machine gun, frowning and loudly asking what he was up to. The girl did the same, saying that he was interfering with their duties, and let him give up the walkie-talkie right away. The main character waved his other hand with a smile, looking at them, and said, Blue Wolf Emergency Code Request. Recovery Level 101, Recipient, Kim Jin. There was a green screen on the radio and they asked about the Blue Wolf and Kim Jin. The military man with black hair waved his machine gun, holding it with both hands, and shouted in displeasure, asking about the emergency code and whether he was joking. This simply cannot happen. A large helicopter with 4 screws from below was flying in the sky. The guy raised his hands up, smilingly saying that he could. 2 military men looked up at the helicopter, whose shadow hung over them, and one of them shouted that an emergency service helicopter had appeared and that this was even possible. A girl in brown boots descended from a helicopter along a rope ladder. She walked forward and 2 military men stood at attention. Someone shouted that no abnormalities were detected during the performance of duties. A girl with light pink hair and a pink cloak. She had pink glasses on her face. She had her hands in her pockets with a serious face, and someone shouted that it was Mr. Director. The 2 military men put their hands to their temples while Kim Jin stood in front of the protagonist. She took off her glasses, looking at the guy with green eyes, and asked if he had finally decided to go outside. The guy tilted his head, looking at the girl, and replied that it seemed like it was time to move. The girl with blonde hair hugged the guy, closed her eyes with a smile, and said that she missed her. The guy hugged her back with a surprised look. The military man with black hair asked in shock what was happening, and the military girl nearby said in confusion that he really knew the director. The director opened her eyes when the guy said that she was quite popular. He frowned, looking at her with brown eyes, and continued that he felt as if some kind of dirty aura was accumulating here. The director looked over her shoulder, nodded, and replied that there was nothing interesting here. The guy smiled and sighed. A large high building in the middle of the houses. The girl asked if he could warm up. A tall building of turquoise color. A glare of light could be seen on the roof. A man in armor. He could see 3 red eyes and clenched teeth. Pipes were coming from his armor next to his teeth, and he said that this was Lady Rose, Kim Jin. She appeared on time. The main character closed his eyes with a smile and scratched his ear, saying that everyone is some kind of garbage, and he thinks this won't even qualify for a warm-up. The girl with blonde hair behind him put glasses on her eyes. The man with red eyes placed a sniper rifle on the edge of the roof. The back of Kim Jin's head was visible in the red pretzel. The bullet flew forward, heading towards the girl and guy who were standing next to each other. The main character frowned and looked away. He stood in front of the girl, clenching the bullet in his fist, and Kim Jin stood behind him, crossing her arms over her chest. The man in the helmet with red eyes looked at him in surprise. The bullet hovered over the main character's hand. Bright blue energy appeared around it, and the guy said that they use such tools. He smiled, waving his hand. The bullet flew forward from his hand, and the guy said that there is no one normal. The bullet flew through the sniper's head while he was holding the weapon in his hands. The main character frowned and, putting his hand to his chest, asked if he could give them a lecture. He kicked off the ground. A guy with brown hair waved his hand, cutting the purple man into 2 parts. He kicked the gray man. Blue light emanated from his kicks, and the black-haired military man asked in confusion what was happening now. The main character kicked another enemy with his foot, leaving a blue light from the blow, and swung his hand forward, cutting off the head from the body of another enemy, and the military girl said in confusion that she did not even see his movements. A hurricane of blue energy, in the center of which stood the main character, head down, defeated enemies flying around him. The military man with black hair frowned, saying that it was amazing. The girl with red hair next to him replied that he did it in 1 minute. One of the enemies in front of the guy pressed his back to the stones. sitting on the ground and shouted who he was, and they did not report to him that there was someone so strong in Geonmech. The main character approached him, saying that the winner asks questions, and the losing side must shut up and listen. The shadow of a guy loomed over a man in a black military uniform and with red eyes. He told him that judging by his vile aura, they were Hades guys. The military man answered him that he had completely lost his fear. How dare he talk about the great god of death? The main character smiled, lowered his gaze, and replied that he was such a simpleton. That means he was definitely from Hades, and then it had something to do with him. The military man looked at the guy in surprise and asked if he was really an enemy of Hades, and with such abilities he obeys Kim Jin. How is this possible? The guy replied that he is really strong. The main character grabbed the soldier by the head, and he screamed in fear. The guy's eyes glowed with a bright blue light. He squeezed the soldier's head, causing his skull to crack into small fragments, and the guy said that he was not the type who was used to working for someone. The soldier's red eyes went out. He bowed his head. A white cloud of steam came from his skull. The main character clenched his hands into fists and turned his back to him, thinking that he had not fought with a man for a long time. Kim Jin looked at the guy and said that he seemed to be stronger than 3 years ago. He replied that it was natural. The guy said that after Yaksha's brother left, he didn't just have fun. The black figure of a guy with disheveled hair, who waved his hand, saying that he and Eel were breaking up for a while. Eel smiled, looking down, remembering this. Kim Jin stood on the ground in her black boots, saying that he was accepted anyway, and he went outside and contacted her. She put her hands in the pockets of her coat, looking at Eel, and asked, "This means that he wants to work with her?" The guy looked at the girl. Kim Jin extended her black gloved hand to him, telling him welcome. The girl stood in front of a tall building, smiling and slightly tilting her head. Extending her hand, she said that Geonmech is a company that guards this world, which has changed after the war, and they will have to battle with numerous enemies. Eel smiled shyly and closed his eyes and replied that he called her by accident. In fact, he was heading to the academy. The girl asked about the academy. The main character, who was floating in the air, his eyes glowing brightly with blue light, and there was blue fog and energy around him. Kim Jin said he is a striker from the Yaksha team. She looked at the guy in confusion, raising her eyebrows, and asked why he was suddenly going to study. Eel smiled, knitted his eyebrows, and replied that he still needed to get a high school diploma. An institution for training talented people. GSS Academy. A large white building with a green roof and many windows. A large field was visible behind. A girl with dark purple hair calmly looked forward with her green eyes, her hands folded in front of her. Behind her there was a rack of weapons, and she asked. She was wondering why he was in a special class. At the bottom it said, Honanha, the director of GSS Academy. The girl with short blonde hair frowned, answering yes, he is only at stage 1.5. And how come at the bottom it says, Kim Ian, professor at GSS Academy? The director responded via video that it seemed like the professor didn't trust her decision. Kim Ian shook her hands while sitting at the table in front of the blue holographic screen, saying that everything was wrong. Honanha rested her head on her hand, looking through the same screen above the table at the professor, answering that if not, then fine. She asks to take care of this student. Black screen that had a white stripe when the screen turns off. Kim Ian closed her eyes and frowned, holding a piece of paper in her hands, wondering out loud who he was, and a special class was created only for top-ranking students. She opened her eyes and lowered her gaze. In her hands was a certificate of enrollment in the GSS Academy, a photo of the main character who was smiling stupidly. The paper said, Eel, 21 years old, height 182 centimeters, weight 80 kilograms, abilities 1.5 rank. Notes, enrollment by director's recommendations. The girl said that it seemed she was talking about him. She asked who he was. A white building with white feathers flying over it. Eel looked up. He put his hands in his pockets, looking up at the falling feathers with a smile. The guy put his hand to his forehead, looking around with a smile and standing in front of the white building. Thinking that everything was well equipped here, it was not for nothing that he came here, deceived them about the level. The guy closed his eyes, thinking that all he had to do now was study hard. Eel opened his eyes and frowned when he noticed something. A large tower from which a figure of a man was flying. Eel looked at him, saying that someone jumped from the tower. A man with black hair was flying upside down, and the guy said, "Is this really suicide?" Blue energy appeared around Eel. He quickly ran from his place, leaving a pulse of blue energy behind him. A man fell from a tower while the main character jumped between its walls, rising. The girl with black hair opened her mouth and thought who it was. Eel pushed off the ground with his foot, which had a blue light shining around it. He extended his hands towards the girl who was flying down. The guy caught her in his arms, and the girl with black hair looked at the guy in surprise. Eel looked at the girl, turning his head and wondering where to land. The girl with black hair frowned, looking at the guy and wondered when he had time. Eel looked at the girl in surprise, raising his eyebrows and thinking about her body. He landed on the ground on his feet, holding the girl in his arms and lowering his head. The guy looked at her in surprise, asking if she was okay, and the girl put her hand on his chest, asking him to let her go to the ground. A white building with a white area around it. The girl with black hair opened her mouth and exhaled. She reached out with her hand, turning around and closing one eye, thanking him for saving her and saying that she had training. Eel turned his back to the girl, waving his hand and saying that it's not worth it. Suicide is bad. The girl looked irritably at the guy's back, saying that it was training. He continued that even if her body is in this condition. The girl looked at the main character in surprise, frowning. She put her hand on her waist, looking at him displeasedly, opening her eyes wide and wondering how he knew about the state of her body. Sign plate, GSS Academy Special Class. Kim Ian stood at the lectern in front of the blackboard and asked for silence, saying that they would begin the introductory lesson. The GSS Academy is an educational institution for training the strongest and brightest. A guy with black hair and a man with red hair sat at the desks, while Kim Ian, leaning her hands on the lectern, continued that the most gifted students fall into this special class. The black-haired girl closed her eyes, placing her hands on her desk as the professor said that this meant they got the highest scores on the exam. Eel pursed his lips, a badge with his name and the number 1.5 hung on his suit. And the guy thought that he had hidden his power and why he was here. A blue holographic screen began to appear. A message appeared on the screen who he was, and Eel looked at him with his hands on the table. He looked away while sitting at his desk in front of the screen and thought that human relationships are so unpredictable. He didn't think that he would end up in the same class with her. The girl with black hair frowned at the main character. She crossed her arms over her chest, looking at the guy. The inscription above her, Hosan, GSS Academy Special Class, 2.9 points. Eel smiled widely, closing his eyes and gave the girl a thumbs up, thinking let her hang on, suicidal girl. Honanha looked at him in surprise, opening her eyes wide and raising her hands. Kim Ian said they were done for today. The girl stood in front of the door from the classroom, waving her hand to the students and with a smile said that from tomorrow they would begin classes according to the schedule. For now they could choose a prefect and then inform her. A couple of students replied that they understood. The guy with red hair put his hands behind his head and his legs on the table. He closed his eyes, saying, "Wow, at this age he is studying. How infuriating." Inscription, Special Class of GSS Academy, former gang leader, Chogapsu, abilities 2, 8 ranks. The chest of a girl in black clothes with a military badge on her chest, who said what can be done if only those who graduated from the academy receive privileges. A girl with black hair at the next desk from Chogapsu put her hand to her cheek, smilingly saying that it was even surprising to see a former gang leader here. Inscription, Special Class of GSS Academy, former mercenary, Kwohihua, abilities 2.8. Chogapsu pointed his finger forward and said with a smile that she herself was a mercenary. And they were not the only ones here. Yellow cap with a black insert on the front. A guy in a yellow jacket, dark skin and dreadlocks, who was looking at a white phone, pointing his finger at it. Chogapsu said that this guy was a former hunter and the girl asked him at that age. The inscription on the bottom, a special class of the GSS Academy, a former hunter, Pio Hong, ability 2.5 points. Someone sharply slammed his hand on the table and Kwohihua asked if he knew about this girl. Hosan stood up from her chair, placing her hand on the table and closing her eyes, and the guy with red hair answered naturally, "Hosan, she is the director's niece." Eel put his hand to his cheek with a smile, raising his head as a shadow loomed over him. Hosan stood over the guy with her arms crossed over her chest and he asked if she wanted to tell him something. The girl with black hair looked down at him. The main character closed his eyes, raising his eyebrows. Looking at him, Hosan said, "What about becoming a prefect?" And he answered with a smile, "Why him?" The girl looked at him in surprise, remembering how Eel caught her and asked why. "He looks like the strongest of them." Chogapsu and Kwohihua looked at the two of them, trembling, and asked what was going on. The girl with pink hair frowned and shouted with displeasure, "She at least knows who he is." The guy with red hair also frowned. Sweat was running down his face and he shouted that she said that he was the strongest. They both screamed. Someone shouted not to be funny his. Pio Hong stood up from his chair, pointing his finger forward, and shouted with a dissatisfied face that they had seen his student record. It says that he has 1.5 points. Eel smiled widely and awkwardly scratched the back of his head, closing his eyes. Someone loudly asked about 1.5 points and how such a loser ended up in a special class. Ho-san looked at him with raised eyebrows and thought with a calm face that 1.5 was very different from the speed she saw in the morning. Pyo-hong slammed his hand on the table, asking the main character to be honest. He stood next to the girl in front of the guy, shouting what he did to get into this class. Eel replied that he himself did not know. Yellow cap on an irritated Pyo-hong. The guy with dreadlocks sharply waved his fist towards the main character, who dodged the blow and shouted, was he really trying to make a joke? Pyo-hong looked in surprise towards the guy, who avoided asking what. Eel smiled, closing his eyes and smiling, tilting his head to the side. Behind Pyo-hong stood Ho-san, who had dark energy around her, her eyes glowing red. The guy in the yellow jacket stepped back, trying to say something. Pyo-hong crashed into the wall, stretching his arms forward and breaking the wall behind him. He opened his mouth, from which drops of blood flew out, his eyes turned white, and beads of sweat ran down his face. He knelt down, placing his hand on his chest and trembling. The girl in front of him stood with her foot on his cap. Ho-san looked down at the guy, looking at him darkly while there was dark energy around, and said that he knew it was there and was still going to start a showdown. Pyo-hong lowered his head and coughed loudly. The guy raised his head, looking at the girl and putting his hand to his chest, said that he just thought that the main character acted through connections. Ho-san raised her hand back, clenching it into a fist. Dark energy emanated from him, and the girl said that this would be decided not by him, but by the school management. Ho-san waved her fist, turning back. Pyo-hong jumped to the side, running back from the girl, looking at her with a nervous look. The girl looked at him with a frightening gaze of red glowing eyes and asked. He dodged. Pyo-hong clenched his teeth, looking at the girl in fear while sweat ran down his face, and thought that he had screwed up. He remembered how he did pull-ups on the horizontal bar and did push-ups, thinking that he was a former hunter. He wouldn't just stand there and take beatings. Chogap-su clapped, smiling, and said that it seems that the youth have more than enough strength. Not a bad sight. The girl with pink hair next to him confusedly asked him to wait. Ho-san, who clenched one hand into a fist while there was black energy behind her, and Kwo-hee-hwa thought that her eyes were full of sinister energy. Eel placed his cheek on his palm, looking to the side, and thought that it seemed like she didn't know how to control her power. Ho-san's eyes opened wide, glowing red, and the main character thought that he realized this in the morning when he saw her. The figure of Ho-san, hidden in shadow. There were rays of dark energy around, and the guy thought that she had consequences after the unsuccessful revival of the third level. Eel frowned, looking away at her, and thought that special people usually show their hidden abilities and strength. If this fails, such strength becomes a disadvantage. The white figure of Ho-san, surrounded by dark energy, stood in front of Pyo-hong. Around them the desks were destroyed. There were stones on the floor. A guy and a girl were looking at them, and the main character was sitting at the other end of the class, thinking that he was becoming a disadvantage, both physical and psychologically. Ho-san smiled. A purple light began to emanate from her and said that now he has nowhere else to run. Pyo-hong looked over his shoulder at the girl, swore in fear, and frowned, saying that he just expressed his opinion. She was already going too far. Ho-san clenched one hand into a fist, her hair and the tie around her neck fluttering from the purple energy around her, and said that it was not for him to decide. She stood in front of the guy while Kwo-hee-hwa and Chogap-su were looking at them. The guy with red hair said that big problems could happen at this rate. The girl nearby shouted to stop them. Ho-san smiled, looking at the guy in front of her with red eyes, raising her fist to strike. Pyo-hong squeezed his eyes shut, biting his lip and closing his eyes. He sat on one knee, his yellow jacket fluttering with purple energy, and the guy thought how unlucky he was. A hand approached Pyo-hong and the guy opened one eye, frowning at it. Suddenly, Ho-san's fist stopped Eel with his hand, and the guy in the yellow jacket looked over his shoulder at this. Chogap-su's eyes widened in shock and he opened his mouth slightly, frowning and thinking about what happened. Kwo-hee-hwa also looked at this in surprise with her mouth open and thought that it was so easy. Pyo-hong bit his lip, looking up at the main character, and wondered if he really stopped her with 1.5 points. Ho-san looked forward with glowing red eyes. The girl's eyes became their normal color. She stood in front of Eel, who held her fist and asked in confusion what she had done. Eel held the girl's palm with his two hands. He smiled and closed his eyes, bowing his head and asking him to stop, saying that he, as the headman, decided to stop this fight. A white room containing a body scanning machine. There was a window in the room through which the doctor's office was visible. Ho-san was lying on the device. A man in a black suit and glasses stood next to him, in front of whom the system window was open. The girl was lying on the machine in pink clothes. Closing her eyes, the man nearby said, "The pulse is normal. The body temperature is also normal. There is minor muscle damage, so recovery is underway." The man with black hair adjusted his glasses and frowned, saying that she had calmed down now. The man sighed, looking at the system window open in front of him, saying that she started a fight on the first day. Next to it was written, Nam Ju-song, director of the research department of the GSS Academy. Nam Ju-song ran his finger across the system window while the girl lay with her eyes closed and thought that there was very little time. He stopped, clenching his hand into a fist, and wondered if the healer the director had spoken about had arrived. Nam Ju-song turned his head with a frown and thought that the lady should wait a little longer. Ho-san, who was lying on the device while a bright white light illuminated her. A white room in which a group of people stood. In front of them was a man who asked for attention. A man with black hair, stubble, and in a tracksuit smiled widely, raising his hand and closing one eye, said that they were starting training. The inscription next to it was Shin Gi-song, an instructor at the GSS Academy. Shin Gi-song said that today they will make up a team of one special class student and one middle class student. Eel in the center of the crowd was doing push-ups with a smile, closing his eyes and counting 825, 826. All the students standing nearby looked at the guy in surprise. Ho-san frowned, crossed her arms over her chest and sighed, looking forward displeasedly. Behind her stood a guy with black hair, and behind him was Pyo Hong, who put his finger to his lip, looking at the girl. The instructor continued that then they will have a simulation of a fight with artificial chimeras. The score will depend on the number of monsters destroyed, and this will also affect their rank. Shin Gi-song clenched his hand into a fist and said with a wide smile that the artificial chimera had almost the same strength as a normal chimera, and he hoped that they would not be seriously injured. The man raised his hand up, clenching it into a fist, and the students did the same, standing in front of him. The students stood in groups of 2 or 3 people. Some were alone. Walking from them was a guy with shoulder-length blonde hair. His hands were in thick gloves. The guy sighed, lowering his head. The inscription, Kim Tae-jun, GSS Academy Middle Class President. The guy looked at his hands, which were shaking, fixed with a medical splint, thinking that he was finished and how he would fight with such hands. Kim Tae-jun sadly looked at his hands, clenched his teeth, and thought that there was something else. He looked at the blonde-haired girl who was surrounded by other girls. The blonde put her palm to her face, closing one eye and looking to the side. She had 2 ponytails on her head and pink eyes. She was surrounded by widely smiling girls, and the guy thought that because of her he had to become a prefect anyway. The inscription below, Jeong Ga-hee, a middle school student at GSS Academy. Kim Tae-jun hid around the corner, looking to the side. Eel was doing push-ups with a smile, closing his eyes, and the guy with blonde hair thought that it seemed his name was Eel. The main character stopped, raising his eyebrows and looking to the side, while Kim Tae-jun thought that he was in a special class, but he only had 1.5 points. Eel looked at the guy with blonde hair who was standing around the corner, looking at him awkwardly. Eel waved his hand to the guy, smiling broadly, and he wondered why he ended up on the same team with him. Eel knelt with his hand on the floor and said that he was glad to meet you. Kim Tae-jun looked at the guy in surprise. The main character extended his palm. The guy with dark hair smiled, closing his eyes and extending his hand, asking if he was Kim Tae-jun and saying that he was Eel. The guy with blonde hair looked at the guy in surprise, awkwardly moved his hand and said that he did too. He shook Eel's hand, replying that it was nice to meet you. The guy with dark hair's eyes widened and he raised his eyebrows in surprise, thinking what? He looked at Kim Tae-jun, who shook his hand and looked away embarrassedly, saying that he was glad to meet you. Eel thought that he too could not be reborn this way. He looked sadly at the guy in front of him, thinking that his hands were, of course, in terrible condition. A blue screen with a white light flashing on it. 2 people were looking at the large screen. One of them was sitting in a chair, the second was standing next to him. Shin Gi-song put his hand on the chair next to him and asked what the condition of the students was. Nam Ju-song, sitting in the chair and putting his hands on his legs, replied that he did not know. The coach said that he deliberately put these 2 together. Jeong Ga-hee swung her foot towards the robot, looking over her shoulder at Ho-san, who jumped up with her back to her, frowning as one of the robots next to her broke into 2 pieces. The blonde looked forward, raising her leg, and the instructor said that psychologically she was not that mature yet, so she ended up in the middle class. A girl with black hair, one of her eyes had a red glow. There was a glow around her hand, which was next to the robot Violet Energy. One of the robots with red LEDs fell to the ground, broken, with blue pixels around it. Hosan put one of her hands on her waist, and the blonde, looking at her, said that they say that Hosan was unable to be revived at the 3rd level. The girl asked how long it took her to regain her strength. The girl with black hair turned to look at the blonde, her eyes glowing red. Hosan clenched her hand into a fist with purple energy around it, and rays of dark energy around the girl herself as she displeasingly asked if Jeonggahi really cares about her health. The blonde put a finger to her lips, answering with a smile that the Jeong family has always taken care of the Ho family, and she will be very upset if Hosan gets sick. The black-haired girl's fist shook in annoyance as the blonde glared at her. Jeonggahi put her hand to her chin and looked over her shoulder in surprise. Behind the blonde was a robot with red lamps, which pulled its claw forward towards the girl while she looked to the side. She turned around and frowned, raising her hand and right leg, saying what kind of low monsters these were. Hosan frowned, looking at this with bright orange eyes, dark energy flying near her face. She ran forward next to the blonde, who looked at the girl in surprise. Jeonggahi jumped aside, screaming as the pink-haired girl swung her leg, leaving a trail of dark energy. Hosan bent her knee, releasing a beam of dark energy, and then punched the robot while her eyes glowed with a bright red light. She landed on the ground, leaving impulses as she landed on the ground. Dark energy also sparkled from her. Jeonggahi looked at the girl in shock, frowning and raising 2 hands, clenching one of them into a fist, thinking how fast she was. Hosan stood sideways to the blonde, looking over her shoulder with a dissatisfied look. 3 broken robots lay next to her, and the girl said that before worrying about her, it's better to take care of yourself. Jeonggahi frowned at the girl with anger, clenched her teeth, and thought how annoying she was. There was an angry face of a blonde on the screen. Shin Gi-song looked at it, saying that they both had character, while the man next to him thought for Hosan to take care of his hand. The instructor smiled, raising his head to the screen, and said that it seemed that the relationship between them had improved. Nam Ju-song folded his hands in front of him, answering that he was a joker. Shin Gi-song turned to him, raising his eyebrows, and asked, Hosan had a seizure a few days ago, but now she looks healthy. The man with glasses answered with a frown that he simply managed to suppress for a while. Pixels around the 2 figures that made up the blue towers. Nam Ju-song continued that if everything is left as is, it will soon develop into a big problem. A healer should come as soon as possible. 2 people walked through the blue space, which was assembled from pixels. The leader announced that the next team was the prefect of the special class Il, and the prefect of the middle class Kim Tae-jun. The guy with blonde hair looked over his shoulder, where a robot with red lanterns instead of eyes was sitting on the tower, and thought how he would fight a chimera with such arms. And judging by the video, it would be as formidable as a real chimera. The guy was trembling, lowering his head and looking to the side, thinking that if Il only has 1.5 points, why is he acting so carelessly? The guy with dark hair put his hand on his head and turned to the side, raising his eyebrows questioningly. He smiled widely and, closing his eyes, pointed his finger forward, asking what Kim Tae-jun was so afraid of and should not worry. He waved his hands and loudly said that he should be worried. Kim Tae-jun put his hands to his chest, nervously asking if he saw his hands, and he cannot fight. And he with his 1.5 points will have to fight the chimeras alone. Il scratched the back of his head, putting his other hand in his pocket, and asked why he couldn't fight. The guy with blonde hair in front of him shouted that he failed to be revived. It is unknown whether he can be cured or not, and if treatment is not possible, he will have to leave the academy. The system announced that artificial chimeras had been released. Blue pixels dissolved into thin air. A large robot walked forward, red lights glowing on its iron legs and head. The system asked the participants to take up fighting positions. At the tops of the blue towers, many robots appeared, with red lights on their heads and looking down. Il and Kim Tae-jun stood on the ground as many robots stood on the towers and risers above them, looking at them while making growling sounds. Kim Tae-jun raised his head, looking at them in fear, and said that they were surrounded and they should surrender. Because of him the guy was in danger. Il closed his eyes with a smile and clenched his hands into fists. The main character extended his hand to a guy with blonde hair, who looked at him nervously and asked if he was kind. Il put his hand on the guy's shoulder, placing his other hand behind his back. Blue energy gathered around it and blue lightning sparkled. The main character told him not to worry and stay behind him, but in return he would have to help him with his skill. Kim Tae-jun rubbed his other hand, looking at the guy in surprise and wondering how he knew about his skill. In front of him Il frowned and extended his hand, from which bright blue energy emanated. The big robot ran forward with its iron paws. Eel held the robot's head between his palms. He sharply crushed the robot's head with his hands. Blue lightning came out from the impact. The guy's eyes also glowed with blue light, and he said when he breaks one of them, Kim Tae-jun should tell him where the other is. The guy with blonde hair looked at him in shock, opening his mouth wide and wondering what was going on. And is this called 1.5 points? Eel brought his hand back, swinging it, extending the other one forward. There was blue energy around him and robots that were broken into several pieces. Shin Gi-song and Nam Ju-song looked at the screen that was shining in front of them. The instructor frowned, clenched his teeth and asked about the main character. The man with glasses nodded and replied that he single-handedly stopped Hosen's attack. Shin Gi-song looked at the man in surprise, shuddered and raised his hands, saying that this couldn't be happening. Could he really stop it alone? The man with glasses crossed his arms over his chest and sighed, lowered his head, answering there was nothing to be surprised about. Nam Ju-song raised his head, frowning, and said that he managed because she was already in a state of calm. But he was more interested in something else. He said that his rank was 1.5 points. Eel with a wide smile extended his fist over his head, hitting one of the robots, which fell into fragments, and the instructor asked in surprise, "He is in a special class, and he only has 1.5 points. Nam Ju-song nodded, raising his head to the screen, and replied that the director herself identified him. The man frowned. The blue light of the screen reflected in his glasses, and he thought about the director and could it really be him? Kim Tae-jun frowned, looking ahead and shouting from behind, "The direction is 7 o'clock. The main character jumped, putting one hand behind his back. His eyes glowed with a blue light and he kicked one of the robots, which glowed with a bright red light. The guy frowned and looked to the side, asking about the next thing. Kim Tae-jun replied that he was searching. The boy with blonde hair crossed his arms and closed his eyes, lowering his head. There was blue energy around him and he muttered the next one. The guy's eyes opened sharply. They were turquoise with light crosses in the eyes. The area around the guys was green, and a robot was hiding around the corner of one of the towers. The robot ran forward. 3 lights on its head glowed brightly and Kim Tae-jun shouted the direction to 11 o'clock on the right, approaching at great speed. The robot ran towards the main character, who spread his arms to the sides. The robot made a growling sound. He ran at Eel, who clenched his hand into a fist, from which blue lightning emanated, and raised it to strike. The guy's fist was flying forward. There was a blue light around it. Eel hit the robot, leaving streaks of blue energy, its eyes glowing blue again, and the robot fell apart. Eel extended his palm forward, from which blue lightning emanated and struck the robot flying in the air. Kim Tae-jun shouted from the right at 3 o'clock, and the guy with dark hair looked to the side as bright beams of energy emanated from his hand. Kim Tae-jun shouted 9 o'clock. Eel bent his knee, hitting another robot, which crumbled into pieces from his blow. Kim Tae-jun shouted in front. Eel landed on the ground, crouched down. A bright beam of energy passed over him, which cut the huge robot into 2 parts. The guy with dark hair raised his palm next to his face. Lightning was emanating from it, and thought that he wanted to slowly destroy everyone, but that didn't suit him. Kim Tae-jun crossed his arms over his chest, frowning. There were blue pixels next to him and he shouted, 3 at a time. A robot was running along the ground. Next to it was the shadow of another robot. They jumped from the pillars, leaving a stream of air there. The 3 robots screeched as they jumped over the main character, blue energy gathering around him. The guy smiled, clenching his teeth. A blue gleam was visible in his eyes, and lightning flew around. A column of blue energy appeared in front of him, sending pulses across the sky. The 3 robots exploded in the air, leaving behind a cloud of dust. Eel stood on the ground looking at them. White smoke also rose up around him. Kim Tae-jun stood in surprise in the cloud of white smoke that began to dissipate. The boy with blonde hair blushed, looking forward with tears in his eyes. His bandaged hands trembled and he thought that there was help from him too. Eel put his hands in his pockets, standing with his back to the guy, and said that he told Kim Tae-jun not to worry. The main character turned over his shoulder with a smile, saying that there is no need to despair just because he has sick people. In the cloud of fog, the red glowing eyes of the robot in front of the guy were visible. The robot approached the guy, striking him while he stood still with a smile. A robot head with 3 glowing lights on it. Eel swung his leg towards the robot, striking it, and said that if your arms hurt, you can fight with your legs. Kim Tae-jun frowned, looking at the guy in shock, and opening his mouth wide, he asked with his feet. He watched as the main character raised his hand with a wide smile, and wondered if he was taking everything too easily. The guy with blonde hair's eyes widened and said there was something behind him. The robot screamed and jumped over Eel, who scratched the back of his head with a smile, asking what. The guy with dark hair frowned, looking to the side. A blue light flashed in his eyes and Eel thought that his skills were sealed. He immediately realized it. Kim Tae-jun fearfully extended his hand forward, shouting for Eel to be careful, and the main character thought that with a little help, he would become stronger. The robot waved both of its arms, the lights on its head glowing bright red. Eel extended his palm, from which a bright blue light emanated. He grabbed the robot by the neck, bringing his other hand behind his back and clenching it into a fist, bright blue lightning emanating from it. One of the robot fragments fell in front of Kim Tae-jun, who stood with his hand outstretched. Eel held the robot above him. He kicked, trying to get out, and the guy said, his name is Kim Tae-jun. The main character squeezed his hand against the robot's neck, breaking his head. The fragments scattered to the sides. The guy threw the broken robot to the floor, waving his hand. Eel smiled, turning his head. He looked over his shoulder saying that now he would definitely have to make friends with him. Eel stood in the middle of a blue field where robot parts were scattered, raising his hands and asking this all. Kim Tae-jun stood behind him. The guy with blonde hair crossed his arms over his chest. His eyes and body glowed with a faint blue light, and he said that he was not done yet. There was still one more left. Eel hit his palm with his fist, causing several blue lightning bolts to sparkle from his hands, and with a smile told the robot to come here. A robot whose red eye dangled from one wire. The broken robot walked forward, its hand trembling, some parts falling off, and wires sticking out of the body. The robot fell to the ground as the two guys looked at it in surprise. A guy with dark hair put his hand to his chin, saying that he was somehow broken. Kim Tae-jun next to him nodded, saying that he didn't think he was dangerous. Suddenly, Kim Tae-jun opened his mouth in surprise and frowned, looking to the side. He screamed and shouted about the big chimera, and the main character turned around, looking to the side. A huge robot ran towards a guy with dark hair, screeching loudly, and he turned to him. Eel smiled widely, blushed and said that he was cool. Kim Tae-jun was breathing heavily, sweat running down his face. The guy clenched his teeth sharply, pressed his hands to his chest and frowned, thinking that he didn't even know if they could handle it. A huge robot ran towards them, screeching loudly, while the guys looked at it and Kim Tae-jun shouted to the main character to be faster. Two white impacts passed near the robot, from which pixels emanated. He hit the ground sharply, and blue stones fell in different directions. Eel jumped back, dodging and shouted joyfully, but was not caught. The guy raised his hand, over which blue energy was gathering. Eel flew in front of the huge robot, arms outstretched, blue energy gathering near them. He smiled, clenched his teeth and said that he was finally out. Eel extended his hands in front of him, sending blue energy forward, many blue lightning bolts striking the robot. Kim Tae-jun crossed his arms as the energy surge blew his hair and kicked up dust from the ground. He opened his mouth in surprise, frowning and thought what just happened. He is incredibly strong. Eel sat on the broken robot, leaning his hand on it and kneeling on one knee. The announcement about the end of the training sounded and the guy smiled. He stood at work, closing his eyes with a smile, while Kim Tae-jun looked at him in shock. An announcement was made that they were being asked to leave the training field. Eel opened his mouth wide, yawning. He put his hand to his mouth and closed his eyes, saying that it was fun. Kim Tae-jun next to him exhaled and closed his eyes, saying thank God they survived. He looked at the yawning guy who was covering his mouth with his hand and thought that he was definitely much stronger than 1.5 points. Eel turned over his shoulder in surprise, looking at the guy. He waved his hand, turned to him and asked him for the type of support. He asked if the guy could be transferred to a special class and Kim Tae-jun looked at the main character in surprise. He rubbed his hand with his other hand, they were shaking. Kim Tae-jun loudly asked how he would get into a special class with such hands, and Eel raised his hands in fear, frowning, asking the guy not to be angry. Kim Tae-jun asked if he really had 1.5 points and the main character smiled nervously, looking in surprise at the guy in front of him, asking what. Eel closed his eyes and answered with a nervous smile that he simply adores martial arts, so he decided to show off a little. Kim Tae-jun frowned and approached his face. Eel put his hand on the shoulder of the guy with blonde hair and he looked at her questioningly. Eel said that he couldn't have done it without him. Kim Tae-jun exhaled and closed his eyes, answering okay. Eel walked forward, waving to the guy and saying goodbye. Kim Tae-jun raised his hand in surprise, asking where he was going. He extended his hand towards the guy and tilted his head slightly, frowning and thinking that he was completely calm during the fight. Kim Tae-jun shook his head and closed his eyes, thinking that it doesn't matter, it's not for him to say. The two men looked at the screen, which showed the wreckage of robots. Shin Gi-song leaned forward, frowning, and asked if his name was Eel, and the man next to him with glasses nodded. The instructor said that he was too strong for 1.5 points. Nam Ju-song opened the holographic window, putting his finger to it, and thought that it was a student whom the director himself had sent to a special class. He frowned, looking at the screen in front of him, and thought that there was almost no data on him. Interesting, because the power level system never made mistakes. Suddenly Nam Ju-song's eyes opened wide and he loudly asked what, frowning. Shin Gi-song turned to him, looked down and asked what was the matter, but the man replied that it was nothing. Nam Ju-song put his hand to his chin, looked down and said that it was strange. He thought that his heartbeat did not even change throughout the entire fight, just like during a walk. The instructor stood in front of a group of students in a white hall, saying that everyone had done well, and now they would move on to the results. He said that the team of Ho-san and Jeong Ga-hee took first place. However, there were minor breathing problems during the fight. The blonde sighed displeasedly and turned away, closing one eye and crossing her arms over her chest. Ho-san was looking in the other direction behind her. The instructor said that the weakest team is Kim Tae-jun and Eel. Now they can split up. Kim Tae-jun sadly looked away, thinking that he knew it. Jeong Ga-hee next to him put her finger to her chin, saying with a smile that Kim turned out to be tenacious. The guy with blonde hair turned away from her, thinking that she was back to her old self. Shin Gi-song frowned, looked down at them and said that despite minor mistakes and shortcomings, they are both the best, and therefore the team of Jeong Ga-hee and Ho-san deserves an award. Kim Tae-jun exhaled and put his hand to his chest, smiling and blushing. Someone behind Jeong Ga-hee pushed her and the girl blushed deeply, shouting displeasedly what fool dared to push her and who he was. Next to Kim Tae-jun, Eel stood in front of the girl, who raised his hand to his face and smiled, asking her to speak more quietly. And he doesn't really like being insulted, so let him shout more quietly. Kim Tae-jun looked at the guy in embarrassment, and Jeong Ga-hee trembled with irritation. The blonde clenched her teeth in irritation and asked how dare he contradict her. She pushed Kim Tae-jun in the back and he closed his eyes and screamed. Jeong Ga-hee put her hands on her hips, stood in front of the main character with a frown and began to loudly swear at him, saying that he was worthless. Ho-san frowned at the girl. Her eyes glowed with a faint red light and she said that the guy was the head of their class, and how dare she talk about him like that. There was dark energy around the girl. A purple light emanated from her body and Eel looked at her in fear, shouting that she heard it, and she did not call him that. Ho-san looked to the side with a dissatisfied face and asked Jeong Ga-hee to answer. She had insulted him. A girl with black hair stood in front of the blonde with her hand clenched into a fist, and she turned away from her. Jeong Ga-hee nervously frowned and turned to the side and replied that she was just telling the truth. The blonde pursed her lips, trembling. Behind her, Eel leaned towards Kim Tae-jun, asking him if they could leave. He agreed. Eel put his hand on the guy's shoulder, leaned towards him and asked with a smile how he eats with such hands. He asked to let him go while the girls were arguing behind their backs. Ho-san crossed her arms over her chest, looking over the blonde's shoulder at the guys, thinking about the main character, and how when his hand touched her fist, she immediately calmed down. Maybe it was just a coincidence, and she wanted to check it out. She thought that was why she began to watch him. Ho-san sat at her desk, looking at the guy with brown hair who was looking forward. Eel raised his hand with a smile and the girl thought that he was somehow strange. She put her cheek on her hand and sighed, thinking that he liked studying so much, even knowing that in a world where chimeras are raging, physical strength is everything. Ho-san stood around the corner, watching Eel walking. She thought that he was reading something like an English dictionary while he was going to school. The guy held the main character's hand with tears in his eyes, shouting a huge thank you to him, and he would never have passed without his help. Eel smiled nervously, laughing, and the girl thought that he was still attending lectures on the humanities, which no one else attended does not go. The red-gloved fist flew forward. Eel stood by the red punching bag, beating it while Pyo Hong and Ho-san stood behind him. The girl thought that he was still constantly training. She lifted the dumbbell, looking sideways at the guy. A vein popped out on her arm and she thought that it seemed like he was already in the pain field. Pyo Hong nervously looked at the girl, thinking about her strength. Ho-san was breathing heavily as she lay on the pillow, sweat running down her face. She lay on the bed in her blue pajamas, thinking about when she almost died. The girl stood up, sitting up on the bed and leaning her hand on the mattress. She lowered her head and closed her eyes, putting her hand to her chest. There was a figure of a man behind her, and the girl thought that when she woke up from a nightmare, it seemed as if he was always there. Ho-san's eyes widened and she opened her mouth in surprise, thinking that perhaps her aunt had told her about this. Ho-san looked ahead with a surprised look, remembering Ho-Nanha, who was looking over her shoulder, saying that she would bring the one who would save the girl. Ho-san thought, not really, he is the one she was talking about. Someone put a drink with a red package and a picture of a monkey on Ho-san's cheek. The girl touched her cheek, looking to the side. Pio Hong stood next to her with an awkward smile, slightly shaking the drink in his hands and asking if she would like a drink. The girl with black hair took the jar in her hands, thanking the guy, and he awkwardly scratched the back of his head, answering yes. Ho-san lowered her gaze and blushed, asking the guy for forgiveness for that time. Pio Hong looked down at the girl in surprise, saying her name. Jeju Island GSS Lab. A chain link fence that had a yellow sign with a black skull on it that said keep out, and a second yellow sign at the bottom that said caution. Next to the sign, a fence was broken and a man in orange clothing was lying on the ground, shaking. Many people in orange clothes lay on the ground while a man who was surrounded by purple energy approached them, twirling something in his hand and saying what it was. A man with shoulder-length long hair smiled. He held a knife on his finger, from which purple energy emanated, and he said that the GSS guards are such weaklings, it's not like they exterminated all the chimeras. A man was standing on a solar panel on the roof of one of the buildings, glowing purple and twirling a knife on his finger. There were white buildings all around and he said that it was too easy anyway. The man clenched the knife in his fist, inserting all his fingers into the knuckle on it, smilingly saying that even though this was the request of the Hades servants, he liked it. A man stood by a chain link fence with his hands behind his head, the moon and stars shining brightly in the sky. Eel looked up at the sky, leaning on the fence, and said that the day had gone surprisingly well. He frowned, looking up, white reflections flying nearby. The guy looked at the bright moon in the sky, saying that the moon is so beautiful. He smiled. A dark figure of a man with red eyes was visible in the sky, and the guy thought about Hades and whether he was still on the moon. Eel reached out, raising his hand, saying that they even knew about Hades. The guy hit his fists together, saying that he is the god of death. The guy frowned and looked to the side, decisively said that he would kill him and all the chimeras. A large flask with a blue liquid that shone brightly. A man with long hair was visible in it. Two guys stood at the flask. Eel looked at the guy in the white t-shirt from the front and asked Yaksha who it was. A dark panel on the flask, with blue luminous microcircuits. Yaksha replied that this is a station for cultivating a black lady, so to speak, an incubator of young gods. Eel frowned and, putting his fingers to his chin, smiled, asking why he brought him here then. A girl with pink hair and pale skin floated in the flask. Yaksha replied that he was giving her to Eel, and asked him to take care of her. A guy with black hair and a white t-shirt crossed his arms over his chest and said that the black lady is an artificially created god. Eel frowned, his eyes glowing with a faint light. Yaksha said that one must reciprocate, so to defeat one god, another god is needed. GSS Research Center, Jeju Island, a large white building with solar panels on the roofs and a satellite dish nearby. A blue floor on which a group of people stood. In front of them there were two people, nearby there were white stairs. Eel put his hand to his forehead, looking forward in surprise, and thought that it was quite beautiful here. Someone announced to the class presidents from the GSS Academy that the lab tour was starting soon. Eel stood behind the crowd, holding a black backpack on his shoulder, and wondered if that person had come. His eyes widened and he raised his eyebrows in surprise. The guy looked at Kim Tae-jun, who was standing in the crowd with his head down, and the main character thought about him. Kim Tae-jun raised his eyebrow, looking to the side when he was called. Eel waved his hand at him, smiling widely, while other people looked at him in surprise. The guy shouted hello and Kim Tae-jun also greeted him, thinking it was him again. Eel stood behind him, holding the strap of his backpack, and asking where he was, and there were a lot of things there. Kim Tae-jun nervously looked ahead, knitting his eyebrows, thinking that she was not there. Jeong Ga-hee, whose hair was braided in a braid, stood in front of the guys. She smiled widely and closed one eye, saying that they are also here, and let them greet the goddess of the academy. Eel said that she doesn't seem to be the class president, and why is she here? The girl looked displeasantly at the main character, leaned over and screamed how dare he behave disrespectfully with a member of the Jeong family. Eel answered displeasantly, is that really all she can boast about? The girl shouted how dare he insult the Jeong family, and the guy replied that actually insults are their thing. Kim Tae-jun looked at them in confusion. Someone put a hand on the girl's shoulder, calling her. A guy with brown hair, wearing a white robe and round glasses, stood behind the blonde. He raised his hand with a smile and asked if they were classmates Jeong Ga-hee, and he was glad to meet you. His name is Jeong Gi-jun. He is the head of the research center. Eel waved his hand at him with a wide smile, saying hello, and Kim Tae-jun looked at the guy in surprise, saying his name and saying that he was a student at GSS Academy, and he was also glad to meet him. Jeong Gi-jun bowed his head, closed his eyes with a smile, and said that he hoped the tour would be useful to them. A white room in which there were tables with computers, people standing there. They also walked along the corridor between them. The guy said that the GSS Research Center is the real pride of the GSS company. Jeong Gi-jun stood at one of the computers. Next to there was a table with flasks and a microscope. He said that they were currently studying the side effects of a new drug. Eel frowned and looked away, asking about the medicine and what they meant. A vial of purple liquid that someone was holding. Dark energy was emanating from it. Jeong Gi-jun replied that the medicine is called N3KTAR. It is necessary to strengthen the gifted, but the side effects are simply terrible. Kim Tae-jun knitted his eyebrows, sadly looking forward with big eyes. He lowered his head, rubbed his hand, and spoke about the side effects. He was rubbing his arm in a sling when someone called to him. Eel stood next to the guy, who looked back at him in surprise and told him not to worry. He had a different case. Jeong Gi-jun lowered his head. A shadow fell on his face. The bright reflection of his glasses was visible. The guy said that if it was just physical damage, then this was great luck, because the wounds would heal. The man was on all fours. Purple blood was flowing from his mouth. The guy said that in some cases a fatal outcome is possible. The man raised his head, holding it with his hands and screaming loudly. Jeong Gi-jun said that even this was not the worst outcome of events. The man smiled widely madly. His eyes glowed red, and the guy continued that there were cases when test subjects went crazy and acted purely on instinct. There are rumors that they like other people's blood, just like vampires. Jeong Ga-hee raised her hand to her mouth, puffed out her cheeks, and said with a smile that it was most likely because they were weaklings. She pointed her finger at Kim Tae-jun with a laugh, asking why he was silent, whether he had drawn blood into his mouth, or was it because he did not have enough strength to withstand the infusion of nectar. Kim Tae-jun frowned and closed his eyes, mentally asking, "Shut her up." Eel lowered his head, putting his hand to his face, and frowned, thinking about the study of side effects, and that the main task was probably to completely duplicate the properties of nectar. A dark figure of a man, from whom a purple glow emanated. A bright white light emanating from a flask with a purple potion descended towards him, and the guy thought that a drop of water, which was used by the creator of the nectar, Ilvon, and they think they can repeat that elixir. Suddenly, everyone raised their heads, looking up, when the loudspeaker announced, "Attention to the danger, terrorists have entered the building," asking everyone to evacuate. Jeong Gi-jun nervously looked up, frowned, and loudly asked about the terrorists, and how it was, after all, the best special forces were on guard. Eel frowned, putting his hand to his chin, standing in front of the two people, and thought that he was right here. If anyone can penetrate the GSS complex, then he is incredibly strong. The guy's eyes widened in surprise, and he thought that it's not that. These are 7 stars. The guard stood against a white wall in an empty corridor. His body was covered in blood, and the man was holding a walkie-talkie in his hands, trembling, shouting reception, and that this is Sector B3. He is requesting support. Another man suddenly stabbed the guard with a knife, and he let out a cry of pain. A guy in black clothes, with white hair and blood on his hand, walked from the guard. His eyes glowed red, and he said with a smile that he couldn't even play a simple game. The level of GSS abilities had dropped greatly. Why did they become so peaceful? The guy put a black phone to his ear, saying that Sector B3 was destroyed, and if there were any instructions. Sector F-17 said that he had already planted explosives. A sniper in a black suit sat on a tree branch, holding a sniper rifle in his hands. He put his hand to his ear, telling him not to let his guard down. The enemy may have his own aces up his sleeve. The bloody hand that held the phone. A man with white hair walked forward along the corridor, holding his hands in his pockets, saying that he could then take a walk to the bomb shelter. The main nerds must already be there. He smiled, clenching his teeth and frowning, thinking that this time he would definitely kill him. On the man's chest were purple symbols in the shape of 4 pointed stars, and he thought of a curse. There were people sitting in a white room. Kim Tae-jun looked up, standing in the center of the room, and asked what was happening. He thought that of course he had evacuated, but what to do now? People were running scared through the building. A guy in a brown shirt raised his hand, asking not to panic and to evacuate peacefully. The black bag was lying on the floor. Kim Tae-jun thought about where the main character had gone. Kim Tae-jun threw his backpack over his shoulder, sighing and thinking that he had just followed him. Jiang stood next to the man in brown clothes, pointing her finger at him and saying that he wanted her to die and let her close the gate. The man raised his hands, answering that not everyone had evacuated yet. Jiang grabbed the man by the clothes, and he clenched his teeth, closing one eye. She screamed. He didn't understand. She frowned, looking at the man with anger, and shouted that she was the heiress of the Jiang family. Her safety came first. Jiang threw the man aside and he fell to the floor. She told him to get out of the way and she would close the door herself. Kim Tae-jun put his hand on the girl's shoulder, asking what she was doing. He frowned at her, saying that people were still evacuating, and she wanted to close the door. What about Il? The girl answered displeasedly that he should not touch her. Jiang turned to the guy, frowning and shouting displeasedly. Who is Il, that she should wait for him? He doesn't even have the ability. If he's such an important person, let the guy go and find him himself. Kim Tae-jun looked at the girl in surprise, raising his hand. He clenched his teeth in anger, answering, "Oh well." The guy pushed through the crowd of running people, closing one eye and shouting that he would find and save him. Jiang clenched her teeth, looking after him, and thought that he was completely crazy. Really? He was going to find him. Jiang face contorted with anger and she waved her hand forward, shouting to close the gate of the bomb shelter, saying that this was the order of the heiress of the Jiang family. People stopped in the corridor in front of a closed door. One of them knocked on the door. Kim Tae-jun looked in surprise at the people who were screaming in fear why the gate was closed, and let them open it. The guy thought that she really closed it. Kim Tae-jun clenched his teeth and frowned, thinking that it didn't matter. He closed his eyes and lowered his head, thinking that there was nowhere to retreat. Kim Tae-jun clenched his hands into fists. Blue energy emanated from him and he thought that he needed to protect people. Two people with long red hair ran towards the guy from whom the blue light emanated, asking why they closed the gate and whether everyone was so narcissistic about the gods, and who this guy was. Did he really decide to fight? Kim Tae-jun frowned at them, raising his hand when one of the people said that he could get hurt like that. Two people in the same clothes, a black shirt and light pants, and with long red hair. One of them had his right eye covered with bangs, and the second had his left. The guy on the left asked what he was talking about, and the second scratched his neck, saying with a smile, "Kim Tae-jun, don't worry so much." Kim Tae-jun looked at them in surprise, frowning, and thought that they were underestimating him. The guy pursed his lips. Sweat was running down his face and he thought, what if Il were here? The guy with blonde hair raised his head, closing his eyes and loudly shouting, Il. If he hears him, then let him come back quickly and live. The white building of the Scientific Institute. Green leaves of the trees. Someone coughed loudly, asking to be saved. Il smiled, telling the man that he had a strong neck. The guy held the commando in a black suit by the neck, squeezing it, and looked in the other direction, smilingly saying that he hopes Kim Tae-jun can handle it. Il turned to the trembling commando, whom he was holding above him, and said that he would blow up everyone who lies to him. The guy frowned, looking at the man menacingly, saying that he was asking for the last time. They are Kai Song's minions, and he thinks that what happened 3 years ago is enough. Il held the sniper above him. He twitched, shouting that they were 7 stars, teamed up with China to steal GSS Labs developments. The main character frowned and looked up at him. His body glowed blue and he asked about China and if they had teamed up with Hades. The sniper shouted that he didn't know, and the nickname of their agent was Dogby. Il smiled as the man shouted that this was all he knew. The main character frowned at him, asking with a smile if he said that he would leave him alive. A man was sitting with his back against a tree. Il was holding something in his hands, standing with his back to him, and said that it was becoming more interesting. It seemed like he had already gone all the way. The guy held a dark helmet in his hands, thinking that Kim Tae-jun would wait a little longer and he would be there soon. The guy put a black helmet on his head, thinking that if it was him, then it would be difficult for the GSS guards. Il slammed his fist into his palm, walking forward wearing a helmet with dark glass over his eyes, and said that this time it's serious. Jiang stood at a table on which there were many monitors. A holographic screen with the image of Ho Nanha was open above them. The guy grabbed his head, shouting that even though they had blocked the leak of important information, the girl replied that she would send him to he has reinforcements. So let him briefly explain the whole situation. Jiang adjusted his glasses and lowered his head, saying that 4 sectors were completely destroyed. A total of 54 employees were killed, and 2 more elders from the academy were not evacuated to the bunker. Ho Nanha looked at him in surprise, frowning, and asked if they were prefects from the academy, and the guy answered yes, they came on an excursion. Ho Nanha opened her mouth and sighed. She said that it seemed to her that they did not need support, so let her focus on defending the bunker. Jeong Gi-jun looked at her in shock, frowning, sweat running down his face, and he asked in confusion. The girl replied that she understood them. Honana smiled, closed her eyes and raised her hand and said that there are real talents among the students at the academy. There were people standing next to the door to the bunker, knocking on it, asking it to be opened. Kim Tae-jun stood in front of two people with red hair who were lying on the floor. The face of one of them was covered in blood. His eyes were white. The guy was surrounded by blue energy and he thought that he had defeated them, and that's the main thing. The boy with blonde hair raised his hand, looking up with a frown. In front of him stood a guy with white long hair and black clothes, who put his hand on his neck. Dark energy was flying around him and Kim Tae-jun thought who he was, and his aura was somehow strange. Kim Tae-jun stood in front of him, asking who he was and why he came. The man replied that he couldn't see for himself, and did he really defeat them? That's interesting. The guy with white hair smiled. He bent down, moving one hand back and the other forward, smilingly saying that he sees that Kim Tae-jun can do it, and let him have fun this time. Kim Tae-jun clenched his hands into fists, holding them out in front of him, and asked what he was talking about. The guy with a crazy smile opened his eyes wide, stretching his hand forward. Dark energy was flying around him and he said that George said that he should work normally, and now he is working. Kim Tae-jun thought what was wrong with his aura. He closed one of his eyes, and two figures appeared in front of a guy with brown hair. Two guards in dark clothes stood in front of the guy, who looked at them in surprise. One of the guards asked how he was. Then the second told him to move away and they would deal with him. Kim Tae-jun thought that it was good that the support squad had come. The guy with white hair struck, leaving a trail of dark energy behind him. The guard jumped over him, dodging and shouting that he missed. Kim Tae-jun looked forward in surprise, a small wound visible on his cheek. Sweat ran down the guy's face and he frowned, yelling to be careful. The guy with white hair smiled, clenched his teeth and said that actually he got it. One of the guards with short brown hair opened his mouth in surprise and frowned. Kim Tae-jun and the second guard bumped shoulders. The guard closed his eyes, asking what was going on. The guy with white hair raised his index finger up with a wide smile. There was dark energy around him, and dark chains behind his back were holding one of their guards in the air. A guy with white hair looked forward with a wide smile and a crazy look, asking how they did it. The eyes of the guard who was flying in the air turned white and he frowned, shouting loudly and asking what it was. Kim Tae-jun and two guards looked at the man who was shrouded in chains and who was screaming about his body. The guard fell to the floor, hitting it. The guy with white hair frowned, looking ahead and asked how they did it, and did they really think they could defeat him. The guy smiled widely. Black chains were flying behind him, and he raised his hand, shouting did they really think he was just an amateur? But he's not. He's the best. One of the guards raised his hand, closing his eyes and asking the second, who was looking forward with a frown, if they could retreat. There was a large purple cloud of fog on the ground, from which rays of purple energy were emanating. One of the dark-haired guards frowned, saying that he would not give up and he could not defeat them. The man with white hair pierced this guard with his hand, punching through his stomach. He screamed loudly from the blow. Purple energy followed the guy. The guy took his bloody hand out of the man's body. Kim Tae-jun and the second guard looked at this, and the guy with white hair said that they couldn't even touch him. The guy with white hair smiled widely, holding his arms out to the side with a crazy look in his eyes as purple energy shone around him, saying that the hunt had begun and let them run. Kim Tae-jun clenched his teeth and frowned, squinting one eye and thinking that this is not how things will end. The people who were standing at the door to the bunker, some were hitting the door, others were hugging or holding their heads, and the guy thought that it was too late to retreat. He clenched his hand into a fist, blue energy glowing around it. Kim Tae-jun lowered his hands, clenching them into a fist. Blue energy appeared around his legs and the guy thought that he would stop him. He looked forward. One of his eyes was wide open, and the other was squinted, and he called out to the guy with white hair, calling him a scoundrel. Some noise was heard in the corridor. Two people in black armor looked forward, asking what it was. Eel ran forward, leaving beams of blue energy behind him. He cast wings of wind, knocking down two people in black uniforms. The guy frowned, looking forward through the glass of his helmet, and thought that this was the same aura as them, and let Kim Tae-jun be patient a little longer. Four men in black uniforms stood in the corridor, looking forward, shouting at the guy to stop and that these were GSS reinforcements. Someone shouted what was happening. Eel clenched his hand into a fist. Turquoise and blue energy began to glow around it. The guy waved his hand and four people flew back. Rays of turquoise energy appeared around him and he cast a wind blade. People screamed loudly. Kim Tae-jun clenched his teeth. Many abrasions were visible on his face. He trembled, lowering his hands and clenching them into fists, lowering his head. The guy with white hair smiled, looking at him and raising his hand, said that he was still standing and he was surprised by this. Kim Tae-jun raised his head to the man in front of him, who was saying that they would test how long he could hold out. Kim Tae-jun's eyes widened and he frowned as he thought that it wouldn't be possible to kill him right away. He thinks that 3 hits will be enough. The guy with white hair frowned, squinting at him. He jumped forward, raising his arm to strike and told him not to slow down. Kim Tae-jun closed his eyes, clenched his teeth and screamed. He stood there with his eyes closed, but nothing happened. The guy frowned and opened his eyes slightly, asking what. In front of him stood Eel in a black helmet, who stopped the man's hand with his palm. Kim Tae-jun looked at the man in the helmet who exhaled and wondered where he came from. Sweat was running down the face of the man with white hair, and he looked at the guy in surprise, asking what and thinking that he managed to block his blow. The man jumped away, leaving a trail of air behind him, and wondered why the GSS was hiding him. Eel approached the guy with white hair, raising his hand to his chest and with a smile said that he was too slow. The man clenched his teeth and thought who he was. Flying back, the guy with white hair extended his hand, shouting that he was a scoundrel. Eel kicked him in the face. Green and blue lightning came from his kick and he told the man to shut up. Kim Tae-jun looked at this in surprise. One of his eyes squinted and turned white and the guy thought about the guy's voice and why the main character was wearing a helmet. The guy with white hair crashed into the wall, screaming in pain. Kim Tae-jun thought that even against such a monster he was very capable. Eel stood over the man, putting his hands on his waist and asked what he said last time. He couldn't cope with a strong opponent with just tricks. The guy with white hair looked up at him and frowned, asking what. Eel put his hands on his helmet, asking if he had forgotten it, and it had only been missing for 3 years. The white-haired man's eyes widened and he clenched his teeth, saying that it was him. Eel smiled widely, raising his helmet above his head and told him that they could skip the greeting. They still had something to talk about. The man was sitting in the office at a wooden table. There were 3 large windows behind him and he asked who had come. A man at a wooden table who folded his hands in front of him. He had black hair and stubble on his face. Below the inscription, Commander-in-Chief of the Republic of Korea, Yang Min-ho. The man in brown boots walked forward. A guy in a brown uniform and purple hair clasped his hands behind his back, asking why he was called. Inscription below, Hunter of the Republic of Korea, Song-yun. Silhouettes of people standing next to each other. Yang Min-ho said that 7 stars attacked the Jeju Research Complex. The man with black hair frowned, saying that according to their information, their target was the GSS secret files. Song-yun lowered his head, asking about Jeju and saying that it was nonsense for them. Yang Min-ho narrowed his eyes and replied that at the moment it is known that they broke through the 4th level of defense. Song-yun looked up and frowned, asking why he was called. Yang Min-ho stood up from his chair, leaned his hand on the table and shouted to immediately go to Jeju and assess the situation there. The man looked at the guy with a frown and told him to act immediately. Song-yun pursed his lips as he looked at him, a bead of sweat running down his face. He put his hand to his forehead and raised his head, shouting just like that. Kim Tae-jun rubbed his shoulder with his hand, raising one eyebrow and thought this was amazing. Eel stood in a fighting stance in front of a man with white hair, who raised one hand and clenched the other into a fist. Eel smiled, also clenching his hand into a fist. A bright blue light glowed around it and he asked Dogby if he was still alive. The guy with white hair wiped the blood from his lip. Looking at the guy from under his brows, there was dark energy around his fist and he shouted that he had been waiting for a long time. Dogby extended his hand, firing a beam of dark energy forward and shouted that he was waiting for the day when he could kill him. Eel apologized, saying that he dodged. The guy jumped next to Dogby. He clenched his hand into a fist and with a wide smile said that now it was his turn. The main character hit the guy with his fist. The blow sent a strong impulse through the air and Dogby flew back, screaming. Eel ran after the flying guys, asking where he was. Dogby clenched his teeth, looking down at him angrily. He put his hand to the floor, from which small stones flew. Dogby landed on his feet, resting his hand on the floor, driving along the ground and breaking the rocks on the floor. Eel frowned at him, clenching his hand into a fist with turquoise energy glowing around it. The guy leaned his feet on the ground, breaking the stones under his feet, and suddenly jumped into the air. Dogby clenched his hands into fists, frowning at him with bright purple eyes, beams of dark energy around him. He raised his head, looking at the main character, who was flying above him surrounded by blue and green energy. Dark energy gathered around Dogby's hand and he called the guy a scoundrel. Dogby frowned, raising his hand to strike and asked how dare he underestimate him. Eel smiled widely and frowned, raising his fist to strike and replied that it was so. They punched at the same time, their fists colliding, blue and purple energy crashing into each other. Eel above Dogby, blue and green energy flew next to the main character, and dark purple energy below next to Dogby. Impulses from their impact passed along the ground. Eel smiled, his eyes glowing with a faint purple light, and he said to just give up or he would die. Dogby looked at him angrily, looked up and said that he will not, and until his curse disappears, he will not give up. Dogby flew back, turning his head away. Black drops of blood were visible. He opened his mouth wide, lying on the ground, his eyes turned white. One of them was filled with blood. Eel stood next to him, shaking his hands together. Someone asked if he could kill the wind god, and Kim Tae-joon frowned, asking about the wind god in surprise. He thought about a man who stood on the stones in the middle of a destroyed city. There was green energy around him, and the guy thought that the god of the wind was one of the terrorists from the War of the Gods. His eyes widened, sweat ran down his face, and he wondered if Eel was the god of the wind. Eel stood next to the defeated Dogby, who lay on the ground with his head down and looking at him. Eel kicked the guy in the cheek, saying that he passed out, and he should have given up when he offered. The main character threw the guy over his shoulder, holding him and closing his eyes, saying that now they will interrogate him. Eel turned to Kim Tae-joon, asking how his hands were, and the guy with brown hair raised his hand, muttering something. Eel smiled, closing his eyes, and said that it was good that he was not hurt. He was worried about him. The guy with brown hair silently looked away. There were many abrasions on his face. Kim Tae-joon frowned at the main character. One of his eyes was half closed, and the guy asked if he was the god of the wind. He stood in front of Eel, who sat down on the ground, saying that they could talk later. The guy silently opened his mouth. He jumped up sharply, holding Dogby on his shoulder, and Kim Tae-joon asked in shock what and where he was going. Red sunset sky with birds flying across it. The night sky with the moon and stars shining on it. Dogby closed his eyes, frowning. He suddenly opened his eyes wide. Abrasions were visible on his face. The guy was sitting on the roof, looking around, asking where he was. The man next to him said that he had finally woken up. Eel smiled widely, sitting in front of the guy and closing his eyes, said that he thought that the man had already died, asking how he was feeling. Dogby got down on one knee, clenched his hand into a fist, and angrily said that he was going to kill him. Suddenly, blood began to flow from the guy's nose, and he opened his eyes in shock. He shouted what was happening, and Eel, sighing, rose to his feet, saying that if he wants to live, then let him tell him why he attacked the GSS. Dogby put his hand to his nose. Blood began to flow down it, and, frowning, he replied, "Let him kill better." Eel smiled, closing his eyes. He clenched his hands into fists with a wide smile and answered okay. Dogby raised his hands in fear, and said that he was joking. The main character blushed and waved his hand, apologizing and saying that he didn't do it on purpose. The guy with white hair put his hand in front of him, thinking that everything was bad. Dogby lowered his head and said that he would tell everything. A man with dark skin, long hair, red glowing eyes, and 3 pairs of arms. His body glowed with a purple light, and Dogby said that Hades had regained his powers. Dogby frowned, looking forward with red glowing eyes, and said that 7 more stars had recovered. Eel crossed his arms over his chest and nodded, saying that he knew it. Things were getting worse and worse. Dogby looked at him with wide eyes and said that they wanted to get the GSS elixir. Eel opened his eyes, frowning at him, and asked about a copy of the elixir. Dogby put his hand on his clothes, saying that there is something else. He unbuttoned his jacket, revealing his chest, which had 3 tight red stars on it, saying that they promised to rid him of this. Eel closed one eye and smiled widely, saying that this is the matter, and does he really think the elixir will help him? Dogby clenched his teeth in irritation, answering of course, what was the point of him taking on this otherwise? The main character raised his hand. White pixels appeared around them, and he said that he should have told him earlier. He would have helped. The guy called the Dark One. A bright blue light glowed next to his hand. Dogby stood in front of the guy on the roof. A small girl with long pink hair, a white blouse, and a black skirt. She sleepily rubbed her eye, asking what happened again. Dogby pointed in shock at the girl above the main character's hand, asking what it was and not to tell him that it was a black mademoiselle. The girl replied that no, it was her mother. She said that she was a black lady, asking Eel who the guy with the white hair was and who he was. The black lady smiled, sitting on Eel's shoulder, saying with a smile that he seemed familiar to her. Pixels emanated from her. The inscription at the bottom, the artificial god Black Lady. Dogby clenched his teeth in anger, looking at the girl. The black lady said that his aura was similar to the aura of her mother. Il turned to her, covering his face with his hand, and said that it was because she cursed him. The girl looked at the guy in surprise. Dogby wondered if the black mademoiselle had a daughter. Il stood over a guy with white hair, putting his hand to his chin, and asked the girl if she could heal him. The girl thoughtfully said that the chances of this were only 1 in 5. Dogby asked her what would happen if it didn't work out. Il frowned and said that he would die then. The girl replied that the guy was right. Dogby looked at them in fear, smiling nervously, and said that they were joking and may God save him. The main character and the black lady stood in front of him. Dogby shouted that he did not want to die. Ambulances were parked next to the building. People were being carried on stretchers, and other people were standing nearby. Kim Tae-jun was sitting on a bench with his head down. His leg was bandaged. He was holding crutches in his hands. The guy had a bandage on his eye. Someone nearby said that first those with severe wounds. Another replied that he understood. Kim Tae-jun sadly lowered his gaze and wondered where the main character had gone. He remembered how Il stood next to the defeated Dogby, thinking about the wind god and how he must have killed that monster. Kim Tae-jun looked forward sadly, pursing his lips, and thought that he hoped this was not true. He kept his hand on his crutches, cursing loudly, and someone next to him said that he knew. Kim Tae-jun dropped his crutches, looking in surprise at the main character next to him, and asked how long he had been here. He put his hands in his pockets and answered with a wide smile that just a little. Il looked to the side, saying that the guy did a good job. Kim Tae-jun blushed and lowered his gaze, touching his cheek with his finger and answering that he did nothing. The guy pursed his lips, timidly saying that he had a question. Il raised his index finger to the forehead of the guy, who looked up at him in surprise and said that they would talk when he got better. Il put his hand on the guy's shoulder, asking him to listen, and Kim Tae-jun looked at him in surprise, asking what was wrong. The main character smiled, saying that he had a proposal. He pointed at himself with his thumb, put his other hand in his pocket, and said with a smile that he, the wind god Io, would heal his hands. There were rays of turquoise energy next to the guy. A guard in a brown uniform stood next to the wooden door, his hands clasped behind his back. A man in a black glove slammed his fist on the table, loudly asking why the GSS laboratory was attacked. Young Min-ho extended his hand, holding his fist on the table, and angrily asked to answer. A guy in a black uniform with brown short hair was tied to a chair. He clenched his teeth and closed one eye, saying that he already knew everything. And if only he had not come, the man asked about him. The guy remembered the main character, saying that he is the one who controls the wind. Young Min-ho narrowed his eyes and frowned as he asked about the wind. He remembered the figure of a man who was surrounded by turquoise energy. Il turned over his shoulder, raising his hand, blue lightning flying next to it. Young Min-ho thought that this was really the god of the wind, and he had returned again. A large dark swirling building with blue windows. A girl with pink hair sat at the table, putting the phone to her ear and thanking the main character for his help. He replied that it was not worth it. Il held the phone to his ear when the girl said that the 7 stars were being reborn, so he should be careful. The guy stood in a dark jacket over a white shirt and dark pants. He put his hand on the fence, looking down, and answered with a smile that if something happened, he would simply destroy them, and also asked to do him a favor. Il remembered Kim Tae-jun, who looked away in embarrassment, asking to transfer one student to his class. The girl raised her eyebrows in surprise, putting her hand on the table, and asked about the student. The guy answered yes, his name is Kim Tae-jun. Kim Ian with a smile pointed at the petrified Kim Tae-jun, who was standing in the classroom, and said that from today he will study here and let the students greet him. The guy thought what was happening. He thought that he had just left the reporters when 2 microphones were handed to Kim Tae-jun, asking how he could comment on the situation. Kim Ian put her hand on the guy's shoulder with a nervous smile, telling him not to worry, and he thought that this was a special class. Kim Tae-jun frowned and closed his eyes, thinking that after returning from Jeju, he would be treated like some kind of hero. Il sat at his desk with a smile, closing his eyes and resting his cheek on his palm, and Kim Tae-jun thought that he had really planned all this. The guy with brown hair tiredly opened his eyes and thought that he had sorted it all out, and maybe he was still sleeping. Kim Ian clutched a black folder to her chest with a wide smile, saying that he could sit in any empty seat. The guy nervously answered yes. An empty desk with a wooden chair next to it. Il turned to the guy with blonde hair with a wide smile, saying that it seems he has already recovered. He extended his hand to the side, saying that yes, he is already better. He thought, this is definitely the same god of the wind. Kim Ian left the classroom, looked over her shoulder, and said that the class hour was over and have a good lesson. The students answered yes. Pyo Hong frowned and turned to the side. He looked over his shoulder at Kim Tae-jun, who looked down in embarrassment and wondered if this was the same guy from the news. Someone asked. He went to the GSS laboratory. The guy with blonde hair turned in surprise at Cho Gap-soo, who smiled and waved his hand next to his head, saying that he heard that he saved people there. The guy with red hair also said his name. Behind him stood Kwo Hee-hua, who cheated green bubblegum bubble. Kim Tae-jun smiled, closing his eyes, and said that he was pleased to meet you, saying his name. Eel at the next desk said what a shame. The guy with brown hair turned angrily at him and shouted at whoever was talking. A school corridor along which people walked. Eel put his hands behind his head, asking who he was in the special class. Kim Tae-jun next to him answered that he was so worried. The guy with blonde hair lowered his head and closed his eyes, sighed, saying that he, of course, tried to qualify for the second level, but never got into a special class. Eel replied that well, he had rank 1.5, and he was able to get in. The guy stopped in the corridor. Kim Tae-jun stood behind the main character, saying that he needed to tell him something. He turned to the guy in surprise, removing his hands from his head. Kim Tae-jun raised his hands, asking the guy if he could definitely heal his hands. Eel with a wide smile asked if he really thought he was cheating. Kim Tae-jun frowned, asking him if he was the same wind god from the Yaksha group. Eel closed his eyes with a smile, raised his hands and replied that it was the case, although something has changed. He took Kim Tae-jun by the shoulders and he looked up at the guy in surprise and asked what had changed. The protagonist's face became serious and he looked down at the guy with brown hair and told him to come to the training ground at night, then he would show him everything. Kim Tae-jun walked from the main character along the corridor, which was illuminated by the light from the windows, and thought that he had fallen into something dangerous. The black lady asked in surprise if Eel was sure he was an ordinary person. The guy with brown hair was looking at his phone while the girl was sitting on his shoulder, asking if he really wanted to tell him everything. The guy replied that yes, he was a good guy, and besides, he had talent. The black lady put her hands on her cheeks, her eyebrows knitted together, while Eel said that they needed allies to defeat the 7 stars. The girl tried to say something. Eel interrupted her, frowning and telling her to look away. Someone was watching them. The black lady flew forward through the air, frowning and asked where. The guy pointed his finger to the side, looking down at his phone, speaking there. A nearby white building, on which a small dot could be seen, pointed at it. Eel asked who she thought was there, and the black lady replied that they would check now. Frowning, she closed her eyes, saying that she was still a black lady. The girl spread her arms to the sides. White pixels appeared around her, and on the system windows next to her it was written, starting the target recognition process and the secure information level protocol. A system window appears with the message process completed. The girl's purple eyes with green pupils opened wide and she said that she knew it was one of the army scouts. Song-yeon held the binoculars in his hands with a surprised face, wondering why the main character was pointing at him. Eel praised the black lady. He walked along the corridor, looking at the phone, and the girl asked what he would do next. The guy replied that for now he was not bothering them, so let him watch. The girl asked in shock what, and Eel replied that if he hurt him now, then there would only be more problems will become, and it looks like Young Min-ho is starting to suspect something. Eel remembered a man with black hair and stubble, who folded his hands in front of him, thinking that he should not have spoken then, but you can't change the past. Eel looked at his phone in shock. His eyes turned white and he thought that there was still a lot of work left to do. Night, dark sky, 2 houses in the city. Young Min-ho stood in his office by the window, holding the phone to his ear, asking for a report. The person he was talking to said that there was nothing special. Song-yeon was eating something, squeezing cheese between his teeth and looking through binoculars, saying that he only eats and studies, and talks a little with others. Young Min-ho said, so he hasn't noticed yet, and the guy with purple hair removed the binoculars from his eyes, looking at the earpiece in his ear. He frowned when Young Min-ho told him not to worry and continue observing. The guy agreed. Song-yeon stood on the roof of the building near the chain-link fence, looking at the round building, and Young Min-ho asked what the object was doing now. The guy replied that 24 minutes ago the object entered the training ground. He was currently watching from outside. Young Min-ho answered him okay and continued monitoring. A figure of a man could be seen on the roof of a white building. Kim Tae-jun stood in front of the building, adjusting the red scarf around his neck and closing one eye, thinking if it was impossible to meet earlier, and how cold it was. He stood in front of a round building. The guy looked to the side with a worried face and wondered why it was so late and really wanted to shut him up. Kim Tae-jun remembered the main character who was surrounded by powerful blue energy and thought that he could have killed him back then. The guy entered the dark room, asking if Eel was here. He took a step, stopping. The guy looked at Eel, who had his back turned to him, calling him. The main character looked over his shoulder at the guy, saying that he had arrived. He took Kim Tae-jun's hand in his and told him that there was no time and they needed to go. The guy asked what he was doing. Eel smiled, holding the guy with brown hair by both hands, and said that first they would heal his hands. He looked at him in surprise, opening his mouth. Kim Tae-jun looked down, raised his eyebrows in surprise, and asked if this was possible. The doctor said they needed at least a year. Eel replied that astrologers say that he died yesterday. Eel looked at the guy with a smile. There were blue pixels around him, and he asked if Kim Tae-jun really doubted him and should not compare him with them. Kim Tae-jun looked down in surprise and thought what it was. There were also blue pixels next to him. The guy with brown hair looked up in surprise at the main character, who was holding his hands while blue energy shone around them. Eel said that of course he is the worst terrorist ever, but he is also the best doctor in the world. Kim Tae-jun looked at him in surprise. His hair was flying with energy and he thought that this was incredible. There was not even pain. Eel let go of his trembling hands with a wide smile, asking if anything hurt. Kim Tae-jun looked at his palms in surprise, asking how he did it. The main character closed his eyes and raised his hand, answering that he only slightly corrected the flow of energy in his body. He said that the guy could take off his bandages, and Kim Tae-jun looked at him and asked seriously. The white bandages fell to the floor. Kim Tae-jun sadly looked at his hands, which were covered with dark scratches, and said that the pain had passed, but nothing had changed in appearance. Eel replied that he had calculated everything. The guy had a white bottle in his hands, and he said that you need to smear your hands with this and they will disappear. The guy with brown hair looked at the bottle in shock, frowning and shouting that it was nectar. He rubbed his hand and nervously asked how he got it. It was so expensive, while Eel picked up the jar of nectar in his hand. Eel remembered a guy with white hair who pointed forward with tears in his eyes, saying to give it back later, and with a big smile he replied that someone gave it to him. He poured a purple liquid onto the guy's palms, which he held out, and said that he didn't have to worry about the side effects. He got rid of them. Kim Tae-jun looked at his hands in surprise, saying that they really were disappearing. The bottle reflected the eyes of the main character, who frowned while holding it and said that nectar without side effects is the best medicine in the world, although it is not always used for a good cause. Kim Tae-jun frowned with his mouth wide open and asked Eel to take a look. He extended his hand, on which the black scratches had disappeared, and shouted that they had disappeared. The guy with brown hair smiled broadly, raised his hands, and said that he couldn't even believe that everything was so simple, thanks to Eel. The main character crossed his arms over his chest with a smile and closed his eyes, saying that he may not thank him, but in return the guy will help him. Kim Tae-jun looked at him worriedly, saying that he has no money. The main character smiled, opening his eyes glowing blue. Kim Tae-jun looked at him in surprise, raising his eyebrows. His body leaned to the side and he asked what the guy was doing. A guy with brown hair was lying on the floor and Eel was sitting next to him, closing his eyes and telling him not to worry. He didn't need money. The guy grinned, looking at the guy with a gloomy look, saying that he was just making fun of his body. Kim Tae-jun screamed as he sat up on the ground, closing one eye and rubbing his head. The guy was sitting among the rubble of buildings. There was a red sky above him, and he said, "This is a restricted area. Or maybe this is an old training field." The guy's eyes widened as he looked forward in fear, his mouth open. He got up from the ground, and someone nearby asked if he woke up. Kim Tae-jun looked up at the main character, who was standing next to him with a smile, and asked what. Eel closed his eyes and with a wide smile told him not to worry. "This is subspace." The guy with brown hair confusedly asked about subspace. Eel pointed his finger to the side, looked there and said that the spy would not see them here. From the outside it looked like they were sleeping. A turquoise portal. On the floor you could see two figures of guys lying on the floor. Songyeon looked at them through binoculars, thinking that when he uses his powers, he is very exhausted. Kim Tae-jun put his hand to his chest, raising the other, worriedly asking about the spy, and whether there were really enemies at the academy. Eel asked the guy about his hands. He looked down at them and said in surprise that everything was fine with them. The main character replied with a smile that this subspace is a complete copy of reality. In other words, his hands here are the same as in their world. Kim Tae-jun looked at the guy with tears in his eyes, calling him, and he laughed, sticking his tongue out at him. Eel raised his index finger and said that now they will begin his rehabilitation, and let him start with acceleration. Kim Tae-jun looked at him in surprise, raising his eyebrows and raising his hands, asking about the acceleration. He closed his eyes and clenched his hands into fists. Blue energy glowed around him, and the guy thought that acceleration was a good name. He stood in front of the main character, thinking that this was like changing gears on a car. Eel looked at him displeasedly, frowning, and asked if this was all and let him stop fooling around. The guy with blonde hair lowered his hands, saying he had just been cured. Eel lowered his head, putting his hand to it, and said, "He probably doesn't quite understand." The guy said that he already has the second level, and Kim Tae-joon looked at him in shock, asking for the second level. Kim Tae-joon's hands with black burns. Eel replied that yes, his hands are the basis of his strength. The guy with dark hair closed one eye and crossed his arms over his chest, saying that even without him it was clear. Young Minho remembered how, blushing, he stood in front of the screen on a wooden stand, confusedly saying that the meter gave a result of 1.9. Eel displeasedly asked why he trusted the machines. The main character frowned, looked down at the guy in front of him, and shouted to him to try again, and this time let him believe in himself more. Kim Tae-joon silently looked at him in surprise, raising his eyebrows and parting his mouth. He closed his eyes and frowned, thinking that he could handle it. Blue energy appeared around the guy again, and he clenched his hand into a fist, thinking that first he needed to even out his breathing. His eyes opened, glowing blue. Kim Tae-joon looked down at his hand, which had dark red energy around it, and he said, "Is that really why they hurt?" The guy clenched his hand into a fist and clenched his teeth. Sweat flowed down his face. The main character said to believe him and he could destroy this force. Dark debris split, falling down. A bright blue light shone around the body of a guy with brown hair, and he opened his eyes in surprise. Kim Tae-joon's eyes also glowed blue, and he thought that his energy flow had leveled off. And was this really a second-level acceleration? Eel smiled, looking at him, saying that he knew that he could handle it. The guy replied that it was like he was born again. Eel with a wide smile raised his hand, which had turquoise energy around it, saying that now they will create a special move for him. Kim Tae-joon loudly asked what. The guy remembered the girl with black hair who was punching the monster, thinking about her. He remembered how the main character released a stream of energy towards the robot, thinking about the guy, and also about how Dogby released a beam of dark energy while thinking about it. Kim Tae-joon opened his eyes wide, frowned, and said that they are created by trial and error. Eel, with a wide smile, collected a ball of turquoise energy in his hand, telling the guy to repeat. He asked how he did it, and Eel replied that it was easy. He released turquoise energy towards the guy with brown hair, saying that Arub should try to avoid him. Kim Tae-joon scared away, shouting that he was crazy. He dodged in different directions with a frightened expression on his face while the main character launched streams of energy at him. Eel materialized another turquoise ball of energy above his hand, asking how it felt. The guy looked at him in confusion, saying that he was completely crazy. Eel smiled widely. Blue rays of energy were flying next to him, and he said that then he would complicate the task. Now he must catch the ball. The turquoise ball flew next to Kim Tae-joon, who jumped away from it, thinking that the guy was mocking him. He clenched his teeth and clenched his hands into fists, frowning, thinking that then he would move on to the second stage, acceleration. He stood in front of Eel, who had a large turquoise ball flying above his hand, and thought that it might be better to destroy it. The guy with dark hair pointed forward with a smile, releasing a ball of turquoise energy at the guy in front of him, who looked at him with a frown and an open mouth. Kim Tae-joon clenched his hand into a fist, thinking that he needed to concentrate all the energy in his hands. He raised his hand to strike, looking at the ball of energy with blue lightning sparkling around it. Kim Tae-joon hit it, and a bright explosion of energy passed in front of him. The guy with blonde hair looked in surprise at his fist, from which steam was emanating, and wondered if it really worked. Eel crossed his arms over his chest and turned his gaze to the side with a smile, asking now that he understood. This is his strength. Eel walked up to the guy, taking him by the wrist and looking at his hands. Said Shock Punch, and isn't that a cool name? Kim Tae-joon looked at him with wide eyes in surprise and asked about Shock Punch. He thought it sounded terrible. Kim Tae-joon had tears in his eyes and blushed. The guy closed his eyes and said that his name was terrible. Eel smiled widely, answering that he tried. He held the guy by the hands. Rays of turquoise energy appeared above them. The guy with blonde hair raised his head in surprise, looking at them, and Eel said that now they are moving on to training. Kim Tae-joon asked what in surprise, throwing his head back and opening his eyes wide. The main character slammed his fist into his palm. His eyes glowed faintly, and there were turquoise rays of energy above his head as he said that he had a long and difficult path of effort and perseverance ahead of him. Kim Tae-joon lay trembling on the ground, breathing heavily and saying that they were finally finished. Eel stood next to him, sighing with a smile and crossing his arms over his chest, asking what he was talking about. He sat down next to the guy, closing his eyes and saying that now he needs to say something. Kim Tae-jun also sat down, looking at the guy in surprise and asking what he was talking about. They sat next to each other on the red ground while the main character crossed his arms over his chest and said something to the guy. Kim Tae-jun frowned, thinking about the man with black hair who stood with his back and said that this means all the information about the main character, and Yaksha was just a fairy tale. But what is everything for and who are these gods? Eel closed his eyes with a wide smile, pointed forward and answered, doesn't he believe it? He knew it. He said with a stupid smile that at first he also thought so, because if there is an omnipotent being, then why did their world become like this? The guy looked down, saying that if all these gods are just a bunch of losers. 3 gods, a man with blonde hair who held a lightning bolt, a man with black hair and red clothing who held a spear, and a man with white hair who held out his hand and held a trident in his other hand. Eel crossed his arms over his chest and frowned, saying what if he caused a great war for his amusement? Kim Tae-jun raised an eyebrow at him and said that it was true. Eel remembered 3 people in white shirts who stood with their backs and bowed their heads and said that unfortunately this is the truth of this world. Blue sky, many buildings in the city. Kim Tae-jun sat at his desk with a tired face, looking at the ceiling. The main character greeted him with a wide smile. The guy with blonde hair closed his eyes and sighed, wishing good morning, and Eel, at the next desk, waved his hand, asking how he liked yesterday, and the guy replied, thank you for at least keeping me alive. Kim Tae-jun looked to the side, noticing something. Eel looked at the blue system window in front of him with a smile, pressing his finger on it and saying that he will study physics and economics today. Kim Tae-jun thought that he really wasn't joking yesterday. The main character closed his eyes and with a wide smile said that studying is so cool, and the guy thought what kind of creature he was. The guy put his cheek on his hand and looked away, imagining Eel running with his tongue out, holding a diploma in his hands and saying that he graduated from school. The guy thought what kind of dream it was to get a high school diploma. Kim Ian abruptly opened the door to the classroom, calling out to the students. She slammed her hand on the table, frowning, and said that all classes for the day were cancelled. Everyone should go to the laboratory immediately. Chogapsu put his feet on the table and his hands behind his head, frowning and asking if she could tell what's wrong. The professor looked down at him, frowning, saying that this was a real mission. Kim Tae-jun opened his mouth in surprise and frowned, thinking about the real mission. Eel at the next desk fearfully put his hand to his chest and wondered why they were doing this to him. Nam Ju-song walked forward with his hands in his pockets and said that he was glad to see everyone and that he was Nam Ju-song, the head of the research department of GSS Academy. The main character looked at him as the man said that he would get straight to the point. Kim Tae-jun frowned, looking ahead as he continued, saying that they had to destroy the Chimera's nest. Chogapsu crossed his arms over his chest and sighed, turning to Pyo Hong and saying whether there will be a plan or explanations or if they should just go there. Pyo Hong asked seriously. The guy in the cap raised his hand, asking if destroying the Chimera's nest was not the job of the hunters. Nam Ju-song extended his hand, pointing to a translucent white map with red dots on it, and said that the GSS was short of hunters, and now they understood why he had collected them. Eel smiled, remembering Kim Jin, who smiled widely, waving her hand and telling the guy to come to her after school. She will give him money. The guy looked away and wondered if this was really her doing. Hua blew a pink bubble gum, asking if they would be given equipment. Kim Ian put her hands behind her back. Behind her there was a bright screen with a picture of armor and she said of course, each of them will be given a special suit. She looked ahead, frowning, and said that this was also a special equipment developed by a research center, so let them try not to break it. All the students raised their hands to their heads and answered that they understood. Ho-san walked down the corridor. Behind her was Nam Ju-song, who said that if there were any problems with communication. The girl looked at him, her red tie and hair flying in the wind, and she replied that she could handle it. The man adjusted his glasses, answering that he would wait for her. Ho-san smiled as she looked at him, apologizing for being a burden. Tunnel entrance, Sector B2342, Seoul. A group of students stood in front of a dark tunnel with 2 black and yellow safety signs. Eel touched his chest with a smile, looking down at the black armor he was wearing and thought it suited him. He frowned, looking ahead and wondering how Dr. Nam Ju-song could sew such a cool suit. Kim Ian frowned, telling everyone to prepare to enter. She said that she would now explain the meaning of this approach, due to the fact that there are 2 entrances to this tunnel. They divided them into 2 teams. The tunnel from which the red dark energy came out, Kim Ian said that the first team is Ho-san, Eel, and Pyo Hong, and the second team is Hua, Kim Tae-jun and Cho Gap-soo. Kim Tae-jun worriedly extended his hands to the main character, saying that he wanted with him, but he crossed his arms over his chest, smiling and thinking that they certainly work well together. Il looked at Pyo Hong, who was looking forward with a frown and saying that today he would be reborn and become a new better version of himself, and thought that he was more interested in playing with this selfish fool. Ho-san looked to the side, frowning and asking the main character what he was looking at. Il thought that she was a time bomb. The guy crossed his arms over his chest with a smile as they stood inside the tunnel, and thought that he would have some fun with them. Il turned to the guy in the yellow cap and closed his eyes, asking why he was so calm and thought he could kill all the chimeras. He replied that, in fact, he had already fought with them. A large iron core with tubes coming from it. There were red rings in the center. Pyo Hong frowned and said that their main goal was the core. They would break it and the rest of the chimeras would be like ants without whiskers. Il with a wide smile showed the guy a thumbs up and said that this is a good attitude. He simply responded well. Il turned to the girl and she asked what it was, and the guy said that let them fight together with Pyo Hong, and he will cover the rear. The guy leaned over to the girl and put his hand to her face, saying that if they got sick, he would quickly heal them. Ho-san, confused, answered okay. Il walked forward from her, putting his hand to his head and saying that this is Tima and they are moving along the tunnel. Ho-san stood behind him, wondering what was wrong with him. Pyo Hong picked up a blue creature with red glowing eyes and looking at it, said that they were close. Il stood near a huge wall of wires, some glowed red, and the guy touched one of them, asking if it was something like an umbilical cord, only larger and for a chimera. The guy in the cap looked at him and replied that he was right, all chimeras are connected to the core. Ho-san sat next to a large green lizard, which had bone spikes on its back, and red lanterns glowed on its legs, tubes emanating from its body. The girl thought that the chimera was an artificially created life form. Red bright eyes in the dark, the girl said here they are. 3 students stood in front of the monster. Pyo Hong clenched his hand into a fist, saying that this place was a chimera production plant. He raised his fist to strike. It began to glow with a bright yellow light, and the guy frowned and said that that's why they needed to destroy it. He sharply hit the paw of the tiger, in whose body wires and flashlights were visible and which stuck out its tongue. Another monster with a long tongue ran forward. Its eyes glowed with a red bright light and it roared. A snake with iron plates on its back and red glowing eyes also hissed. Ho-san shouted that this was disgusting. She extended her hand forward, from which a beam of purple dark energy emanated. Beams of violet energy cut the body of one of the chimeras into 2 parts, and cut off the head of the second chimera. Il smiled looking at this and crossed his arms over his chest, thinking that she was good. The fluffy chimera ran towards the guy who was not looking at her. He extended his hand towards the chimera. A stream of turquoise energy came out of his hand, which pushed the monster back. A fluffy turquoise chimera lay on the ground, trembling and with its mouth open. Il approached it, thinking that they were somehow strange. The guy extended his hand to the chimera. Splashes of blue blood could be seen from it. Il tore something out of the chimera's body by raising his hand. He looked at the red core, with the Roman numeral 7, wondering if 7 stars had made the chimera. The guy squeezed his hand, and the core disintegrated into small pieces. He frowned, saying that he would have to personally rip off all of their heads.